Hi, everyone, and welcome to our next installment of Interviews with Foucauldians. Today, I am here with Verena Erlenbusch-Anderson, and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Verena, if you don't mind just introducing yourself and your affiliation and saying one or two things about your philosophical interests.
Okay. Well, I'm Verena Erlenbusch-Anderson. I'm an associate professor at Syracuse University. I'm in the philosophy department, but I'm also affiliated with political science and women's and gender studies. And I'm a critical theorist, I would say, broadly construed. I'm particularly interested in questions of political violence. So I work at the intersection of political theory, philosophy, history, and terrorism studies. And I also have sort of side interests in, well, not just side interests, I have interests in method and political theory. And also I've written on Foucault, and I've written on issues of diversity and inclusion in philosophy.
Yeah, you wrote a really interesting piece about the figure of being a foreigner in philosophy, which
That's
just
right.
it spoke to me personally, not only because I myself am a foreigner in philosophy, but because I do think it's just a philosophically interesting question, which is what's the makeup of our discipline or of this discipline?
Yeah.
And so you've written about a number of figures that are traditionally associated with what is known as continental philosophy. So you've written, for example, about Agamben, you've written about Judith Butler, you've written about Walter Benjamin, about figures that are taking resources from a specific philosophical lineage and using those resources to think about the contemporary moment. And one of those figures that you turn to is Foucault. And I don't know if this is accurate, so correct me if it's not, but it seems like of all these figures, Foucault plays maybe a slightly bigger role in your thinking, at least insofar as, for instance, your book on terrorism, which we'll return to in a few minutes, is framed as a Foucauldian project. Is that fair to say, or would you qualify that claim?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that at least in terms of the people I draw on explicitly, Foucault, looms the largest.
Mhm.
But I think that the way in which I think about things is also shaped by a range of other people like, Benjamin and Butler. Um, so, yeah, so I think they are not sort of explicit points of reference in my writing all the time, but they are definitely always in the background of how I think about various issues.
Great, and many of my students are currently also reading Judith Butler, and especially her latest book on nonviolence. So
Mhm.
there will be interesting connections for them to make,
Yeah.
and to see people drawing from people that they're reading in different classes. So that's always great. Now, in terms of your relationship to Foucault, I just want to begin by asking you a very broad question, which is, because he looms larger than maybe some other figures in your thinking, what is it that you, as a political theorist, as a philosopher, find in Foucault's writings that is particularly appealing? So what's the attractiveness of his work?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I think there are two ways in which I can answer this. One is a bit of an autobiographical answer, I suppose. So it's just that, at the time I was thinking about this question of terrorism, Foucault was just a person who was available to me, and who seemed useful. So he's certainly not the only person, I would draw on. But I think there are a number of things about his work that I find appealing and useful. So, right, one is the way in which he approaches his objects of research. So there's this sort of attitude of skepticism towards things that are taken to be obvious or self-evident. So, in my own case of terrorism, it seems very obvious what terrorism is. And so the sort of Foucauldian ethos, right, is a critical one of, well, let's take a step back and ask if that's really as obvious as we think it is. Then I think there's also an attention to continuity and discontinuity in his method that I find very useful. So, there aren't claims to sort of absolute newness, but there also aren't claims to historical constants. And instead, there is a sort of attention to historical transformation and contingency that we can nevertheless trace that I find very useful. And then the third point that I find appealing about Foucault is, his, what we might call his philosophy of history. He might object to that. But I think, yeah, this, refusal to think of history as a teleological project that's sort of governed by progress and necessity, and instead a way of thinking about history in terms of contingency. I find that very useful.
Yeah, and of the people that I've interviewed for this series, this seems to be a common theme that a lot of people really find enriching and energizing Foucault's method. First of all, this way of thinking about the past that is driven by an investment in critical philosophy, but also by this duality that is there in all of Foucault's writings between paying attention to what remains continuous and at which point maybe there are breaks from the past that introduce a new way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And in your case, you take this to a political register for thinking about terrorism.
That's right.
And so I think this is actually a great place to transition into your book project, which was published in 2018 by Columbia University Press. And the title, I have it here, is Genealogies of Terrorism, Revolution, State Violence, Empire. And so in this book, which you present as a Foucauldian inspired way of thinking about the concept of terrorism, you offer effectively a genealogy of terrorism, just in the same way that, say, Foucault offers us genealogies of sexuality in the four-part history of sexuality, or of the concept of madness in his early work, or institutions like the clinic or the prison. And so I want to take some time to work through your argument in this book. And of course, my students have not read your book, but I think many of them will benefit from really thinking about the details of the account that you lay out, in which you open, very interestingly, by talking about terrorism in connection to what a number of theorists call the politics of naming. So the
Mm-hmm.
politics that go into calling X, Y, or Z terrorism, as opposed to some other related or neighboring term like just an act of violence, or a robbery, or an act of liberation. And so can you talk to me a little bit about the politics of naming as you see it play out in relation to this concept?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it's a more general interest that I have in, how we think about violence, especially political violence, and what the sort of political stakes are in various descriptions or classifications of violence. And so, the question here is not so much to say, well, is some case actually terrorism, or is terrorism justified in certain instances? But the question is, why does it matter? What does it allow us to do if we call something terrorism? And so it seemed to me that these acts of naming, or putting this label terrorism on particular cases of political violence, or sometimes not even political violence, say political protest, right, nonviolent protests, that there is a particular political interest at stake that enables certain practices, usually practices of surveillance and control and repression. But, and this is more recent work that I'm doing, in other contexts, there are also sort of transformative and liberatory claims that are being made in calling something an act of terrorism. So if you think, for example, about discussions about whether Dylan Roof, right, the white supremacist who shot 9 Black people in, I think it was in South Carolina, whether we should call him a terrorist. You see sort of different political interests playing out in those debates. And so I'm interested in what these interests are. And yeah, again, what successfully establishing this claim allows us to do.
Yeah, and I think I can speak for a lot of my students when I say that, especially post 9/11, it's very clear that a certain number of possibilities, institutional, political, become much more salient when that naming act happens, right? As soon as you say this is terrorism, we know that a bunch of things can follow that wouldn't follow. And some of them are all of them are really very high stakes. And so in some ways, and you make this argument in chapter 5 of your book, you make the argument that in fact, our modern day understanding of terrorism post 9/11 does not really begin with 9/11 per se, but is in fact a continuation of something that began truly with the neoconservatism of the 1980s. So it's a little bit older than many of us sometimes believe. I think a lot of people sometimes do trace contemporary discussions of state responses to terrorism to this singular moment in 9/11, and you trace it a little bit back. And I want to return to that, but you say our contemporary concept really emerges in the 1980s, but your book doesn't begin in the 1980s.
Yeah.
In fact, it begins 2 centuries before, in the 1790s, with the Reign of Terror under the French Revolution. And so can you talk to me and to the students about the structure of the book, really about the large scale organization of the argument that you present, which begins from the French Revolution and walks us through a series of case studies, if we might call it that, all the way to the present in which we are living with this new conception of terrorism that emerges post 1980, but that according to you is fundamentally different in important ways from previous conceptualizations of terrorism.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the structure.
Okay. I mean, it's a really difficult question because the presentation of the book is different from the sort of genealogical conception of the book, right? So if we think of genealogy as a history of the present, then the book really is interested in the present. And in fact, the present that the book is interested in is not quite our present today anymore. So the present that the book is interested in is sort of the immediate post 9/11 present. And so that's where I started from, right? So there was something in that moment that was puzzling to me about, this notion of terrorism and the practices that it authorized. And so I started at that moment and I worked backwards. So I worked backwards to, this notion of terrorism that was articulated as a form of like counterinsurgency or insurgency and ideas of terrorism in international law. And then from there, it sort of went back to the Russian social revolutionary practices and the French Revolution. So the book sort of presents the research process the other way around. So it presents something chronologically that really is sort of a genealogical argument.
Yeah, and I think for my students who are not yet entirely comfortable with some of this terminology, it's good to think about exactly this point that you've made, that at least a Foucauldian-inspired genealogy is always a history of the present rather than a history of the past. So you look at a present-day norm, a present-day institution, a present-day social practice, and then you try to figure out what made it possible historically. How is it that we landed on this thing that we presumably take for granted and we see as natural, and you denaturalize it by showing that in fact it came to be as a result of a number of battles and conflicts and tensions, but it very easily could have gone any other way. along the way. And so it could have been otherwise. And so the structure of the book, I'm here thinking now chronologically, the way in which you present the narrative. You open with a chapter talking about the difficulty of even defining what terrorism is and the politics of naming. And then you begin with a chapter on the French Revolution. So we're here thinking about the 1790s, followed by an analysis then of the Bolshevik revolution. So we're now at the beginning of the 20th century, followed by a chapter of the war for Algerian independence, mid-century. And then we jump into this moment where you argue a new form of thinking about terrorism emerges in the 1980s and continues, as you say, into the immediate aftermath of 2001, September 11. And so if we go back to the beginning, just why begin with the French Revolution, right? There's always this question of origins and starting points in Foucault. Why begin here rather than somewhere else? And so in your case, why do you begin here?
So the straightforward answer is because, well, there are two straightforward answers. One is because the French Revolution is usually credited with being the birthplace of modern terrorism. And so part of the effort of the book is to provide a more complicated account than is available in those, more standard mainstream histories of terrorism. And so, I had to address the main moments that are credited as being, important moments in the historical development of terrorism in that literature. So that's one straightforward answer. The second straightforward answer is that the French Revolution, and more specifically, Jean-Lambert Tallien's speech in the National Convention in 1794, was the earliest use of the term that I could find. So there are some, there is some way to say, well, actually, Kant used the term even earlier than that, but I don't really have sort of evidence for that. So the evidence that I have is that 1794 really was the first time the word itself was introduced, at the very least as a new political concept.
And one of the things that I find really useful about your account in that chapter on the French Revolution is that you point out just the extent to, in great detail, the extent to which this label is contested during the French Revolution and the immediate aftermath, where there is this question about who is committing acts of terror and for what end, and which ones of those are justified. And so one of the points that really caught my attention is when you point out that, for example, Robespierre, under the Reign of Terror, there really is this assumption that terrorism is, let's just say in simple terms, a good thing. It's an expression of patriotism, and it's an expression of one's commitment to republicanism, that you want a republic. And so there is this sort of instability to the term that you bring to the fore. And so how, you mentioned that you begin here because you wanted to offer an alternative to the traditional account of terrorism in this moment. And so can you tell me a little bit about what the traditional narrative is, and then sort of how you tweak it or how you depart away from it?
Yeah. So let me see if I can remember this. I wrote this a long time ago, it feels like. But so definitely one traditional account is that Robespierre is the inventor of terrorism, so to speak. And it turns out that he's not. He did not use that term terrorism. He used the term terror, but the term terrorism was used by his opponents against him, right? So the term terrorism was used retroactively to describe Robespierre's reign of terror. So that's one way in which it sort of goes against the mainstream account. And then there is a second sort of line of thought in intellectual history, according to which, in the French Revolution, terror became terrorism as state policy. And again, there's a more complicated story to tell here, because that was certainly, one way in which the term terrorism was used at the time, but there were also other ways in which people used the term, including affirmatively as a way to describe themselves as terrorists, because, if being a terrorist meant, being a defender of the Constitution, then that was a good thing, and one should be a terrorist.
Yeah, and it's one of those moments where you realize just how deeply entrenched in your own historical moment you are. When I read these passages about the positive uses, the sort of embracing of the term terror for political and philosophical reasons, that really, again, brings into focus this notion that this concept that we tend to think of as very clear and with a very fixed referent could have gone in a number of ways in terms of its moral and political overtones. So
yeah.
I thought that was particularly helpful in that regard.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the French Revolution itself, that positive use of the term, didn't really succeed as, in becoming a sort of common use of the term. But the Russian social revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks, referred back to it, and in an affirmative way, right, and described themselves as the Russian Jacobins, and developed the science of terrorism in a very affirmative and sort of positive sense.
And so in terms of keeping the structure and the chronological presentation of this otherwise genealogical project that works recursively or recurrently, as Foucault would say, beginning from the present and sort of recovering the conditions of possibility. So you begin with the French Revolution, and then you jump, as you mentioned, into the Bolsheviks and the Algerian War for Independence. So can you say a little bit about those two moments and why you've chosen them, and what do they ultimately highlight, or what do they prove more broadly about the history of this concept that you're interested in?
Yeah. So the chronological connection is that both of these moments, so the Russian social revolutionaries and the Algerian Revolution, are both sort of successors to the French Revolution, right? So they link up with the French Revolution, or with discourses and practices of terrorism in the French Revolution in different ways. So the Russian social revolutionaries referred to the Jacobins as their model, and they used them as a reference point to develop what they called a science of terrorism as a strategy of class war against the Tsarist regime, and then later against the capitalist class and the bourgeoisie. And so there is a sort of explicit alignment between the main actors or technicians of terrorism in those two moments. Mm-hmm. And then the connection with Algeria is a bit more roundabout, I think. So the chapter in the book on Algeria starts in 1830, right, with the colonization of Algeria, which was a response to some of the social and economic problems that emerged in the wake of the French Revolution. And so colonization there appeared as a strategy to deal with what was regarded as the degeneration of the French people in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And so there's a chronological connection there as well.
And what was that rhetoric of degeneration? And I'm only thinking about it because we just finished reading History of Sexuality, where Foucault uses the concept of degenerescence that emerges in the late 19th century as this fear or this panic about the purity of the race, understood really as a specific class. And so I'm just curious about what the connection was between this theory of population degeneration and then specifically the justification for the invasion of and the colonization of Algeria.
Yeah. So I think there were two main points. One was a sort of economic or international relations point about the strength of France and, and the concert of European powers. So France suffered here, and, for purposes of reputation, colonization appeared as a strategy of sort of national salvation, for making France remain a large European power. And then the other point is that during and after the French Revolution, there was, impoverishment of large sections of the population, and there was sort of petty delinquency, and there were, concerns about how to rid the nation, the population, of these undesirable elements. And so colonies, both penal colonies and settler colonies, were seen as a good strategy to deal with unruly parts of the population, because if you put them in prison, they are freed at some point and rejoin the population. But if you sent them off to the colonies, then you are sort of permanently rid of them.
Well, this makes me think of another interview that I did before, in which one of the interviewees was talking about the prison system as sort of the internalization of essentially a colonial model and the exercise of colonial rule internally in the population. Mm-hmm. And here you're turning that around and pointing out that also we can think about the settler colony as a place that becomes effectively an offshore prison for all these undesirables, so that you not only contain them, but you also eject them from the territory. And so it's just an interesting sort of back and forth to think about these spaces, like the colony and the prison, that play comparable functions depending on how you analyze them.
Yeah.
And so you then have the account of the Bolsheviks and the account of the liberation of Algeria. And this brings us then to the chapter on modern day, the modern day conception of terrorism. And I want to talk a little bit about that, again, because I think many people do operate with a post-2001 interpretation or conception of terrorism and the rhetoric of terrorism. And you actually put it in a slightly larger historical frame. So let's talk about that. So in chapter 5, after talking about these other historical moments, you talk about the rise of conservatism in the 1980s, and now we're looking specifically at an American context, mm-hmm. And the rise of the American empire and the rise of the US essentially to global dominance, at least in terms of military presence and international influence. And so what happens in the 1980s that ushers in a new way of thinking about terrorism?
Yeah. So I'll answer that in a kind of roundabout way by starting with the standard view that you mentioned, right? That like there is a sort of break that is 9/11 in 2001, and then after that we're seeing something new. And so part of that standard narrative is that terrorism is, the cause for certain policy interventions, and in a Foucauldian spirit, I want to turn that around, right? So I want to say terrorism isn't actually the cause of certain, policies, but quite the contrary. Terrorism is the effect of these political interests that crystallize in certain policies. And so what I'm tracing is the political interests that gave rise to this particular understanding of terrorism that was established post 9/11. And so those interests we can trace back to the 1980s with the rise of neoconservatism in the United States, which is sort of underwritten by a narrative of, the liberal state as the only sustainable model in which we can do politics. And so the export of political values like freedom, democracy, economic prosperity becomes a matter not just of national policy, but also a matter of international policy, because states that don't adhere to this model are seen as, threats to national security. And so what you see emerging starting in the 1980s is that, this liberal model becomes the justification for imperial and interventionist policies and, military practices around the globe
And no, go ahead.
as a matter of national security.
Yeah, and you frame this very helpfully through Fukuyama's concept of the end of history. So this notion that with the collapse of communism, really after the late 1980s, early 90s, neoliberalism, understood as a combination of democracy plus free markets, really has become the only viable mode of governance, and that the way forward, therefore, is just the perpetuation and the enforcement of this mode of governance, even if it's by forceful means, which is what gives rise to that justification for American imperialism, where we wage wars for democracy, for freedom, even when they have a sort of exorbitant human cost. And one of the key pieces of your argument that I want us to spend a couple of minutes on is that you point out that in the 1980s, especially in the early to mid 1980s, this rhetoric of terrorism really is framed by the effects of the Cold War and by an attempt to, in a way, rein in the spread of communism, which is understood here in connection to a specific state. With the disintegration of the Soviet bloc in the early 90s, suddenly you have a shift in rhetoric in the United States, where it's no longer the sphere of, Soviet-style communism or the terrorism associated with it, but now terrorism becomes this amorphous thing that is decentralized and spread through society, and it's hard to identify. And because of that, it justifies the sort of gearing up of new strategies, new tactics of surveillance, of policing, of military intervention. And so I want you to say just a few things about the effects of this disintegration of the Soviet bloc and the rise of what we now think of as terrorism, as this thing that is everywhere, but you cannot see it because it hides in the crevices of society, precisely where traditional modes of policing maybe are not capable of going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you already summarized this really well. I think up until the early 90s, it was really the Soviet Union and the ideology of communism that were seen as the threat to national security. And so, this was sort of an identifiable threat. And terrorists were usually associated with, being agents for the Soviet Union or being agents of communism. But then with the disintegration, the threats to national security become more amorphous. And it's interesting that goes, hand in hand with a more amorphous understanding of terrorism. And so the label becomes less and less sort of stable, I think, and there are all these layers of meaning to it. So it means a whole host of different things, right? It means both an ideology, communism, it means a political system associated with the Soviet Union and other states, or also then rogue states, what's known as rogue states, but it also becomes associated with individuals. It becomes associated with certain political ideas and strategies. It becomes associated with, forms of insurgency, so like guerrilla warfare. And so there are all these different, conceptual components that make up this weird thing that is terrorism. And in fact, that was what I started with. That was my starting point. And so the genealogical project, because we've talked a lot about the chronological structure,
Yes.
But the genealogical project was to trace each of these components and see, where we might find their descent or their emergence, so to speak.
And also alongside with this production of terrorism in the post-1980s moment, one of the threads of your argument has to do with race, and in particular with the association of the figure of the terrorist with the sort of Muslim look-alike. And in the book, towards the end of the book, you have a really interesting case study of the Boston bombings, the marathon bombings in 2013, was that 2014, something like this?
Mm-hmm.
And you read that alongside this question of the relationship between our conception of terrorism and Muslim identity. And so can you just say a few things about that? Because I know all my students will be familiar with that particular case study because they lived through it in a way that, of course, the other historical moments you describe are historically significantly more distant. So what does this moment post 9/11 in 2013, 2014, what does it signify for you?
Yeah. So I think what happened in the wake of 9/11 was that the sort of apparatuses of terrorism and the way in which we think about terrorism became specifically racialized in particular ways. And I think, you know, throughout the historical cases too, terrorism works as what we might call, following Foucault, a mechanism of racism. But by racism, he means something specific, right? He means the protection of a particular version of whiteness, of, you know, normality, to put this in air quotes. And so for him, it's about, you know, it's basically like a form of eugenics, right? It's about protecting the biological integrity of the human race. And so I think that is something that you can see at all different points, although who constitutes the race changes in these different moments. So in the French Revolution, it's the nation. In the Bolshevik Revolution, it's the class. In Algeria, right, it's the French nation again. And then 9/11, the way in which the racialization of terrorism happens is in distinction from what some scholars call the Muslim-looking person, right, or the Muslim look-alike, which includes not just Muslims and, you know, people of Arab origin, but it includes everybody who has, you know, certain phenotypical features, or even, you know, Sikhs, like the turban is often mistaken as a Muslim, you know, symbol. And so the case of the Boston Marathon bomber is interesting in this regard because it's very complicated. Because especially, so there are two brothers, right? Zohar and Tamerlane Tsarnaev. And the older brother was not an American citizen. He was, I think, a permanent resident. He was also married to a Muslim woman. And the younger brother, Zohar, was an American citizen, a naturalized US citizen, who had immigrated from Chechnya, right? So that's in the Caucasus region, and so the brothers are Caucasian, and so, you know, the kind of like archetype of whiteness, and in fact, Middle Easterners by census categories are categorized as white in the United States. And so I just found the response, and also the different response to the two brothers, really interesting, because Tamerlane, the older one, was, you know, presented in this really like caricaturish way, as sort of recognizably Muslim. But the younger brother was harder to classify because just phenotypically white, he appeared as white, or I mean, depending on what census categories you use, right? He is white. He was an American citizen, but he was also Muslim. And so this fact that he was Muslim, but also a US citizen, produced very strange debates about, you know, whether he was white, whether he was really an American. And so I think in this case, you saw all kinds of anxieties about, you know, race and what is American identity, you saw these anxieties play out in this case.
Well, and that anxiety comes out already in the term domestic terrorism, right? This notion that this thing that is traditionally thought to be outside of the border of the nation state suddenly is homegrown, and that in some way it has contaminated the very fabric or the very social body. And in terms of this analysis of are they white and are they American, I found it interesting that very well-known politicians were sort of falling on different sides of this question and entertaining this question of whether somebody could be Muslim and American, or whether you could be a terrorist and white at the same time. And the fact that people just couldn't put those two things together in the same sentence without having to add qualifications, which just speaks to the racialization of this concept that is underneath and not really all that underneath, especially in our present day moment.
Right. And even, you know, some of the politicians who would deny that he was a terrorist did so in really racialized ways, right? So I forget who it was, but somebody said, oh, if you look at him, all you see is a kid in a hoodie, right? But the hoodie itself is a racialized symbol in the United States, right? So it's still marking him as not quite white, not the right kind of white, right? Definitely not a normal, in air quotes, proper member of the national body, you know, who deserves protection. So I think it works to reinforce a particular image of, you know, who and what the nation is, who is included, who deserves protection.
Yeah, I have one last question about your work on terrorism, and then I just want to transition to one last shorter theme before we conclude. And that is going to harken back to a comment that you made about 20 to 25 minutes ago that I wrote down just so that I wouldn't forget, where you said that this book project, Genealogies of Terrorism, emerged as a way of making sense and understanding in a historical sense and in a genealogical sense the post 9/11 moment. And then you said, but that's not our historical present anymore. And so it suggests to me that maybe you are thinking that we are entering maybe a new way of thinking about terrorism. Are there new conditions on the ground? So since the moment the book was written and now, what's your interpretation of the way in which we collectively think about terrorism? Or is it fair to say that we are still in this post-1980s moment, post-Soviet disintegration moment, and we're still sort of working through it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, much of this is sort of current work, so I don't have a super firm view about much of the stuff yet, but definitely one thing that I've noticed that has happened really in the past year or so is a concerted effort both in terms of counterterrorism policy, but also in terms of sort of public discourse to classify white supremacists as terrorists. And so this is something that, you know, in the years following 9/11 was regarded as like unpatriotic and definitely a big no-no. So to talk about, you know, white supremacists or misogynist attackers as terrorists was just not something that happened. And there are a number of cases where you can see this, you know, starting in the 90s with Timothy McVeigh, but then going through, you know, to the mid 2010s with, you know, Dylan Roof and others like him. And so starting last year, the Department of Homeland Security has started coming out with a bunch of reports where white supremacists are increasingly, you know, included in the category of terrorism. And so this seems to me um, a shift, right? I don't know if it's not new because, you know, in the 1960s, white supremacists were surveilled by the FBI under the COINTELPRO programs. So it's not entirely new, but it's different, right? And so I'm interested in figuring out how it's different, what's happening. And what's interesting to me is also that I think in especially the public discourse about white supremacy as terrorism, um, there are different ways in which people understand um, what terrorism is and also what white supremacy is. So the Department of Homeland Security has a very narrow understanding of white supremacy as, you know, the horrible beliefs of a few misguided individuals who are particularly extreme. But there are other ways of thinking about white supremacy, you know, as a social political structure. And so depending on how you think about white supremacy will shape what counts as white supremacist terrorism, right? So you have like the white supremacist extremist shooter who kills people, you know, in a church or in a synagogue. But then on the other hand, you might say that in fact, fairly mundane forms of treating, you know, people of color in this country might count as terrorism if you think of white supremacy in a broader way.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it highlights the extent to which concepts that are traditionally used in a relatively stable form, like immediately post 9/11, then can be subject to further social contestation down the line. Earlier you also made a comment about potentially revolutionary or affirmative uses of terror for the purposes of social justice. And I think this might count as one of them, right? Where in terms of the politics of naming with which we began, the politics are very different between calling a person of color a terrorist and calling a white person a terrorist just because of this deep history, where historically it's only been meaningful and legible in relation to one. And so to suddenly extract it from that history and apply it in a new way, you know, it has a political dimension to it that maybe the more traditional or mainstream application does not.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, you know, once you look a bit more closely, you can see that there is actually a fairly robust tradition, or I should say plural, right? Fairly robust traditions in the history of US social justice activism, you know, going all the way back to sort of abolitionists, anti-lynching protesters, you know, but also in other areas. So, you know, the feminist literature has described, you know, rape as a terrorist institution starting in the 1960s. Of course, you know, there's a longer history of pointing out that racial violence is also sexual violence, and so there's a long history in Black feminism going all the way back to the 1800s, the late 1800s, pointing this out. And so there are pretty robust but marginalized traditions of an alternative politics of naming terrorism that I think are typically erased in, you know, the mainstream white public discourse, but also in the scholarship on terrorism. And I think that those areas are kind of ripe for investigation in the current moment.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like there is this sequel of genealogies of non-mainstream uses of the concept of terror. And it just brings me back to that first chapter on the French Revolution, where you really see the concept moving back and forth between camps, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, but it's just a concept that is in play in a very sort of politically and socially charged field. And so the last thing that I just want to conclude on is a broader question. So moving beyond your work on terrorism and now thinking a bit about Foucault and being a Foucauldian and a thinker who uses Foucault. You wrote an article in 2018 also that was published in the journal Foucault Studies under the title Philosophical Practice Following Foucault. And in it, you reflect on what it means to use Foucault or to take his writings and do something with them. I mean, I think that's the simplest way in which I can express it. And I want to talk about this a little bit because that's a question that all my students will be facing. You know, how do I relate to this figure that is no longer with us and that was thinking about a time that maybe is similar to ours, but maybe is also different. And so in this article, you differentiate between three philosophical ways of engaging Foucault. You talk about what you call a contextualist relationship to Foucault, about an appropriationist relationship to Foucault, and then a methodological relationship to Foucault. So there is context, appropriation, and method. And I just, by way of conclusion, wanted you to reflect on those three ways in which one can position oneself in relationship to him.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess the first thing I want to say is that those are heuristic or analytic distinctions. I think that, you know, most of us who draw on Foucault, do a mix of these different things. But to help us think about, you know, what we actually want Foucault to do for us, I think it's helpful to have some sort of distinctions and tools available. And so the article was more a reflection, I guess, on my own practice more than anything else. And so, yeah, so I think there have been, historically speaking, at least two main ways in which Foucault has been used, or in which people have, you know, worked on Foucault. So there is the one sort of history of philosophy approach, as we might call it, which takes Foucault as a figure in the history of philosophy whose work we can subject to analysis, right, and make sense of it and find puzzles in his work that we try to figure out. And that's what I call contextualism. So it's trying to figure out, you know, based on the context in which he was writing, what he meant, and how we can make sense of his work. And then the second approach is one that I think is fairly common in political science, and especially in sort of a branch that goes by the name security studies, where people borrow concepts from Foucault, such as, you know, biopolitics or governmentality, and then they use it to do their own analyses of, you know, the biopolitics of the war on terror, or the governmentality of facial recognition technology, or, you know, something along those lines. So that's what I call appropriationism, right? You take a concept and you use it for your own purposes. I will say that I think with Foucault, one has to be careful about this approach because his work is so historically informed. And so I think, to me, it's an open question whether the concept of biopolitics as he develops it is actually portable sort of beyond the context in which it was developed. So I think if you want to say, right, there is a biopolitics to the war on terror, then that's a claim that needs sort of genealogical substantiation. We shouldn't take it as a given that the concept of biopolitics will be sort of perfectly suited for this context. But that's the second approach. And then the third one is what I call by the great term methodologism. That was not a wise decision, but
I went with methodology and method just because it doesn't roll off the tongue very easily.
I couldn't come up with a better one, but I'm open to ideas. So that's basically trying to use Foucault's methods, you know, to do what he did, to study your own objects of interest, and to do it in the kind of historically informed, empirical, archival way that is typical of Foucault's works.
And so would you say that your book on terrorism would fall under this third category?
Yeah, so I'm hesitating because there is definitely contextualism there. You know, I write about Foucault. There's also appropriationism there, so I rely on ideas of disciplinary power, biopower, and so on. Um, but yes, I think I would like to think of the book as a genealogy, so as doing what Foucault did.
Great. And so final question for you, which is the same question with which I always end these interviews. Many of my students are interested in Foucault and they are galvanized by reading Foucault in terms of potentially doing this appropriationist maneuver of taking his concepts and then playing with them in new fields, in new domains. And what would be your recommendation, broadly speaking, for graduate students who are reading Foucault for the first time and who may or may not have an extensive philosophical background? So how to think about how to broach this
Yeah.
figure that has had such an important role both in philosophy but also in political theory.
Um, yeah, so I think I have two pieces of advice that I try to heed myself. The first one is something that Foucault once said, which is read everything, study everything. And I think that's important. I think it's important to read outside one's own discipline. Um, it's also important to read, you know, non-academic works, um, to read as much as you possibly can. And the second piece of advice is kill your heroes. So I think, you know, use the work of people as a toolbox, which is also something Foucault said, right? He wanted his work to be used as a toolbox, which means you pick up things that are useful for a particular project and you put them down when they are no longer useful. And you rummage around, you know, other people's works as well. So I think it's important to be sort of intellectually promiscuous and not, you know, not engage in sort of hero worship of particular philosophers.
No,
Foucault
that's a
has limits, so he
like
can't do
everybody
everything for
else.
you. That's right.
No, and I think that's a great point to end on because there is always this risk, especially when we invest a lot of time reading a particular thinker who is so prolific and who in many ways demands so much of your time and energy and cognitive resources to engage in a bit of philosophical hagiography where your object of study gets beatified in some ways. And so the idea of killing your heroes, I think it's very provocative just as a concept, but also probably a really good recommendation in terms of remembering that it's ultimately for your purposes that you're engaging in critical thought, in critical activity. So thanks for that. And so with that, I think we can conclude our interview. And just by way of a very quick summary, we have talked quite at length about your work on terrorism and this book that you've published about the historical origins or conditions of possibility for our way of thinking about terrorism today, which begins with an account of the polysemous use of the concept of terror in the French Revolution during the Reign of Terror in particular and the aftermath. You also write about the Bolshevik Revolution at the start of the 20th century and the Algerian War of Independence in the middle of the century. And then this leads you to this culminating point, which is trying to make sense of our historical present, this reality that we inhabit that is dominated by the kind of thinking that emerges with the neoconservatism of the 1980s, especially as a result in the 1990s of the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And this way of thinking about terrorism that is almost always pejorative, almost always normative, and that associates terror or terrorism rather with an amorphous phenomena that requires equally amorphous state responses. And finally, we also talked about this last but very important point, which is about how one positions oneself in relation to the figures that one reads and studies and publishes about, in this case, Foucault. And I think your last point in particular about killing your intellectual heroes is just as good as it gets. So I want to thank you very much for agreeing to chat with me. And I will ask you to share some resources with me so that I can make them available to my students, especially those who might be interested specifically in the question of what Foucault can teach us about terrorism.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk to them if they want to reach out to me as well.
Okay, great. I will let them know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.